The wind that scoured the high mesas of the Wyoming Territory in the 1880s was not merely weather. It was a physical presence, a living thing with teeth that chewed at the limestone and spat grit into the eyes of any man foolish enough to ride the high trails alone. Jesse Cole was one such man, though he did not consider himself foolish, only accustomed to the brutality of the land. He sat high in the saddle of his bay gelding, a horse named Buster that had more scars on his hide than Jesse had on his own soul, though the count was likely close. The animal shifted its weight on the loose shale, blowing a nervous breath through distended nostrils. Jesse calmed him with a gloved hand on the neck. His eyes narrowed beneath the brim of a sweat-stained Stetson. The sky above was a hard, pale blue, stripped of clouds and mercy. It was the kind of sky that offered no shade and promised no water. Jesse was looking for strays. The drive up from Texas had been brutal, claiming 10 head of cattle to thirst and 3 more to the erratic violence of the river crossings. But the McAllister outfit did not tolerate loss easily. So Jesse rode the rim, his gaze sweeping the broken topography of the canyon floor 1,000 feet below, looking for the rust-red hide of a steer against the endless brown of the sagebrush. He saw nothing but rock and shadow until he rounded a sharp bend in the trail where the cliff face jutted out like the prow of a sinking ship. There, precariously close to the drop, stood a buggy. It was a black, spindly thing, entirely unsuited for this rough country. One of the rear wheels had shattered, the spokes splayed out like the broken legs of a spider. The horse that must have pulled it was gone, likely spooked and running loose in the canyons. But it was not the wreckage that caused Jesse's heart to hammer against his ribs. It was the woman. She stood at the very edge of the precipice, her back to the trail, facing the vast, terrifying emptiness of the canyon. She was dressed entirely in morning black. The wind whipped her heavy skirts around her legs and tore at the long black veil pinned to her hat, snapping the fabric like a flag of surrender. She leaned forward, staring down into the abyss. To Jesse, it looked for all the world like she was measuring the fall. He did not think. Instinct, honed by years of reacting to rattlers and spooked cattle, took over. He spurred Buster forward, the horse scrambling for traction. "Stop!" The shout tore from his throat, raw and loud. The woman turned sharply at the sound of his voice. Her movement was too sudden. The ledge she stood on, an undercut shelf of sandstone weakened by centuries of wind, gave a sickening groan. The earth simply disintegrated beneath her boots. There was no scream. She just dropped. Jesse threw himself from the saddle while the horse was still sliding to a halt. He hit the ground hard, the impact jarring his teeth, but his momentum carried him forward. He scrambled on his belly across the rough stone, his boots seeking purchase on the slick rock, his hand shooting out over the edge of the world. His fingers closed around a slender wrist encased in black silk. The jolt nearly pulled him over. He grunted, the air rushing out of his lungs as his chest scraped against the jagged lip of the cliff. For a terrible second, he hung balanced between the solid earth and the deadly pull of gravity, staring down. The woman dangled in the air, her other hand flailing, her feet kicking uselessly at the sheer rock face. Her veil had torn loose, revealing a face pale with shock, framed by chaotic dark hair. She looked up at him, her eyes wide, and he saw not just fear, but a strange, fierce clarity. She was not resigned to die. She was fighting. "Hold on," Jesse grated out, his teeth clenched. "I have you. Do not let go." He hauled back, straining every muscle in his back and shoulders. He was a man built by hard labor, his strength wiry and enduring, but the angle was awkward. He dug the toes of his boots into a crack in the sandstone and pulled. She scrambled, finding a foothold on a small protrusion of rock, and surged upward. With a final, gasping effort, he dragged her over the lip of the cliff. They collapsed together onto the safe, hard dirt of the trail, a tangle of limbs and heavy black fabric. Jesse lay on his back, staring up at the indifferent blue sky, his chest heaving as he gulped down the thin air. The woman had fallen across him, her face buried in the rough wool of his coat. She was trembling violently, a fine, high-pitched vibration that he could feel in his own bones. His hand still gripped her wrist, his fingers locked tight enough to bruise. He realized suddenly the impropriety of their position. He sat up, gently pushing her back so she could sit on her own. "Are you injured, ma'am?" he asked, his voice rough with dust. She drew a ragged breath and pulled away from him, scrambling backward until her back hit the wheel of the broken buggy. Her hands flew to her face, checking for blood, then moved to her hair, attempting to smooth the wild tangles. She looked at him then, and Jessie felt a distinct jolt, unrelated to the adrenaline. She was beautiful, in a sharp, arresting way that belonged in a city, not on a dusty cliff edge in the territories. Her face was heart-shaped, pale and dusted with the red grit of the trail, but it was her eyes that held him. They were gray, the color of a storm front, and they were studying him. Most women, having just been snatched from the jaws of death, would be hysterical. This woman was shaking, yes, but those gray eyes were darting over his face, his worn clothes, his gun belt, and the desolate trail in both directions. It was a look of calculation. She was assessing her survival, measuring the threat he posed against the salvation he offered. "I am unhurt," she said. Her voice was low, throaty, and sounded like it had been scraped by the wind. "Thank you. You saved my life. I thought you were jumping," Jessie said bluntly. He stood up, brushing the dirt from his chaps, and offered her a hand. She hesitated for a fraction of a second before placing her hand in his. Her palm was soft, uncalloused, but her grip was surprisingly firm. He pulled her to her feet. "I was looking for a way down," she lied. It was a smooth lie, delivered with a tilt of her chin, but Jessie knew what he had seen. She had been leaning into the void. "You would have found a quick way down." "Sure enough," Jessie said. He nodded toward the broken buggy. "Your wheel is done for." "Where is your horse?" "Bolted," she said, dusting off her black skirts. When the wheel shattered, the mare panicked. She tore the traces and ran. "I have been stranded here for hours." She looked up at him, and her expression shifted. The sharp, calculating look melted into something softer, something fragile and appealing. She pulled the torn veil back over her hair, though it no longer hid her face. "My name is Evelyn Hart," she said. "I am traveling to Dry Creek. I fear I am not much of a driver. My husband, he usually handled the horses." "Your husband?" Jessie looked around, half expecting to see a body thrown clear of the wreck. "He passed," Evelyn said quietly. She looked down at her hands, twisting a black ring on her finger. "Last month. An accident on the trail west. A wagon overturn. I'm alone." The word hung between them, heavy and absolute. Jessie felt a familiar ache in the center of his chest, an old wound that never quite healed. He took off his hat, holding it against his leg out of respect. "I am sorry for your loss, ma'am," he said. "It is a hard country for anyone, let alone a woman on her own." "I am finding that to be true," she said. She looked up at him again. "And who is it that I have to thank for pulling me out of the sky?" "Jesse Cole," he answered. "I ride for the McAllister outfit." "Well, Mr. Cole," Evelyn said, looking at the solitary horse standing patiently nearby. "It seems I am entirely at your mercy." Jessie looked at the sky. The wind was picking up, shifting direction. The temperature was dropping, and the pale blue was beginning to bruise with purple on the western horizon. A storm was building, one of those sudden, violent prairie storms that could freeze a man or drown him depending on the season. "We cannot stay here," he said. "There is a storm coming in. You can smell the rain in the sage. Dry Creek is the nearest shelter, but it is a good 2 hours' ride. You will have to ride with me." Evelyn looked at the horse, then at the narrow saddle. There was a flash of hesitation in her eyes, a flicker of that sharp assessment returning. She looked at Jesse's waist, where his Colt revolver sat in its holster. "I have no choice, do I?" she asked. "No, ma'am," Jesse said. "Not unless you want to walk." He led Buster over to the buggy. He unstrapped his bedroll from behind the saddle to make a small cushion on the horse's rump. He mounted first, swinging his leg over with practiced ease, then reached down for her. "Put your foot on my boot," he instructed. Evelyn gathered her heavy skirts in one hand, revealing a glimpse of a booted ankle. She placed her foot on his stirrup, her hand gripping his forearm. He pulled, and she swung up behind him. The proximity was immediate and startling. She had to wrap her arms around his waist to keep her seat. Jesse stiffened. He could feel the warmth of her body pressing against his back, the soft curve of her breasts against his spine. It had been years, 5 long, cold years, since he had felt the touch of a woman in any meaningful way. The sensation was electric, disturbing the numbness he had carefully cultivated. He spurred the horse forward, setting a steady pace back down the trail toward the valley floor. For a long time, they rode in silence. The only sounds were the rhythmic crunch of hooves on rock and the relentless howling of the wind. The scent of her, rosewater and stale dust, filled his head, warring with the smell of horse sweat and leather. "So," Evelyn said, her voice close to his ear. She had to lean in to be heard over the wind. "You ride for McAllister. Is that a life you chose, or one that chose you?" "It is work," Jesse said. "It pays $30 a month and found. A man cannot ask for much more." "No," Evelyn murmured. "I suppose a man cannot—" She tightened her grip on his waist as the horse navigated a steep switchback. "You do not talk much. Jesse Cole," she observed. "Not much to say," he replied. "You have not asked me why a widow from the East is driving a buggy alone through the Badlands." She said, "I figured it was none of my business." Jesse said, "Folks out here mostly want to be left alone with their pasts." "That is true enough," she said. A bitterness crept into her tone. "My husband, he was a man of great dreams and poor luck. He gambled, Mr. Cole, back in St. Louis, then in Kansas City. He lost everything we had more times than I can count. He swore the West would be different. He said the gold was just lying in the streams waiting for us." Jesse nodded. He had heard the story 1,000 times. The frontier was paved with the bones of men who thought the world owed them a fortune. "He was wrong," Evelyn said softly. "And now he is dead. And I'm going to Dry Creek because I have nowhere else to go and no money to go back. I thought perhaps I could start over. Open a dress shop. Or teach. Dry Creek is a rough place for a dress shop," Jesse warned. "It is mostly cattlemen and miners passing through, not many ladies looking for finery. I will do what I must," she said. "I am not afraid of work." There was a steel in her voice that made him believe her. He felt a sudden, strange impulse to comfort her, an urge that felt foreign to his solitary nature. "I know what it is to be left behind," Jesse said, the words slipping out before he could check them. "Oh," she asked. "My wife," Jesse said, staring straight ahead between the horse's ears. "And my boy. 5 years ago. Winter fever took them both in a week, up in Montana." There was a silence, but it was different now. It was not the silence of strangers, but the heavy, respectful silence of shared grief. He felt her head rest tentatively against his shoulder blade, just for a moment, before lifting again. "I am sorry," she whispered. "We keep riding," Jesse said. "That is all there is to do." They descended into the valley as the sun began to dip below the rim of the canyon, painting the clouds in violent shades of bruised purple and blood red. The wind grew colder, biting through Jesse's canvas coat. He could feel Evelyn shivering behind him, her tremors transferring into his own body. Ahead, the settlement of Dry Creek emerged from the dust like a collection of bleached bones. It was a town that looked as if it had been thrown together in a fit of anger. The buildings were unpainted timber, warped by the sun and scoured by the sand. A single main street ran through the center, churned into deep ruts by wagon wheels. As they rode past the outskirts, they passed the leaning steeple of the church, its white paint peeling in long strips. A dog barked viciously from beneath a porch. They passed the livery stable, where the smell of manure and wet hay hung heavy in the air. And then they were on the main street. The sun was gone now, leaving the town in a gray twilight. Lamps were being lit in the windows. The saloon, a 2-story structure with a false front, spilled yellow light and the tinny sound of a piano out onto the street. Men were loitering on the boardwalks, leaning against posts, smoking tobacco rolled in corn husks. As Jesse rode by with the woman in black clinging to him, heads turned. Conversation stopped. Jesse felt the weight of their eyes. In a town like Dry Creek, a woman like Evelyn Hart was a curiosity. A beautiful woman was a prize. A widow was a question mark. He saw the look in the eyes of a group of miners near the dry goods store. A hungry, predatory look. He felt Evelyn shrink against him, making herself smaller. "Ignore them," Jesse muttered. He reined Buster in front of the boarding house, a narrow two-story building that looked slightly more respectable than the rest of the town. A sign hanging by one chain creaked in the wind. "Mrs. Gable's Room's Board." Jesse swung down from the saddle, his boots thumping in the dust. He reached up and helped Evelyn down. Her legs buckled slightly when she hit the ground, stiff from the ride, and he had to steady her. Her hand lingered on his arm. "Thank you," she said. "I do not know what I would have done." "Come inside," Jesse said. "Let us get you out of this wind." The interior of the boarding house smelled of boiled cabbage and lye soap. A severe-looking woman with hair pulled back so tight it pulled her eyebrows up stood behind a high counter. "Mrs." Gable wiped her hands on her apron and narrowed her eyes at the pair. "We need a room for the lady," Jesse said, taking off his hat. "Mrs." Gable looked at Evelyn. She took in the dusty black dress, the wind-blown hair, and the way Evelyn stood, chin high, shoulders back. It was not the posture of a defeated woman. It was the posture of someone who knew she was being judged and refused to flinch. "I run a respectable house." "Mrs.," Gable said, her voice sharp. "I do not take in strays or working women." "She is a widow," Jesse said, his voice dropping an octave. "Becoming dangerous. Her husband died on the trail. Her buggy wrecked on the cliff road. She needs a room. Mrs. Gable." The landlady sniffed. She looked at Evelyn's hands, then at her face. $2 a week, Mrs. Gable said. "In advance, and no men in the room. Meals are extra." Evelyn hesitated. Her hand went to the small reticule hanging at her waist. Jesse saw the subtle panic in her eyes. She did not have the money. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a leather pouch. He fished out a silver $1.25, half a week's wages, and slapped them on the counter. "That covers the first week and her supper tonight." Jesse said, "Mrs." Gable swept the coins into her apron pocket. "Room 4, top of the stairs." Evelyn looked at Jesse, her gray eyes wide. "Mr. Cole, I cannot let you. You can pay me back when you get on your feet." Jesse said, "Go on now. Rest." He watched her walk up the stairs. The landlady watched her too, her lips pursed in disapproval. "That widow don't walk like a grieving wife." "Mrs." Gable muttered to no one in particular. "Walks like she owns the stairs." Jesse turned his cold gaze on the landlady until she looked away and busied herself with a ledger. He put his hat back on and walked out into the night. The wind outside was howling now, kicking up clouds of dust that ghosted through the streets. Jesse walked Buster to the livery, paid for the horse's feed, and then made his way to the small bunkhouse he rented on the edge of town when he wasn't out at the McAllister ranch. The room was a box, a cot, a washstand, a stove. He lit a kerosene lamp and sat on the edge of the cot, listening to the wind rattle the loose boards. He looked at his hand, the one that had gripped her wrist. He could still feel the phantom sensation of her skin, the terrifying fragility of her life in his grip. He closed his hand into a fist. He remembered the way she had clung to him on the horse, the heat of her body seeping into his back. It stirred something in him he had thought dead and buried with his wife. He felt a fierce, irrational desire to go back to the boarding house, to sit outside her door with his gun, to protect her from the hungry eyes of the town. He cursed softly and blew out the lamp, lying back in the darkness. But sleep did not come. The image of her eyes, too sharp, too gray, too clever, burned in the dark. In room 4 of the boarding house, Evelyn Hart stood by the small, grime-streaked window. She watched the street below. She saw Jesse Cole walk away, his shoulders hunched against the wind. She touched the glass. It was cold. Slowly, she lifted her hands to her hair. She pulled out a long, sharp steel hairpin. It was 4 inches long, with a point like a needle. She tested the tip against the pad of her thumb until a drop of bright red blood appeared. She wiped the blood on her black skirt. She was tired. Her body ached from the fall and the ride, but her mind was racing, spinning like the wheels of a steam engine. Dry Creek was a hard place. She had seen the men on the porch. She had seen the greed and the lust. She knew that look. She had lived by navigating that look for 10 years. Jesse Cole was different. He was hard, yes, but there was a crack in him. A wound. He had saved her life, and he had paid for her room without asking for anything in return. That made him rare. It also made him useful. But could she trust him? Really trust him? Or would he eventually turn like all the others when he realized she wasn't the saintly, weeping widow he thought he had rescued? Evelyn slipped the hairpin back into her thick hair, concealing the steel. She unbuttoned the high collar of her dress, staring at her reflection in the cracked mirror over the wash basin. The woman staring back was pale and exhausted, but her eyes were dry. She had to survive. That was the only rule she had left. If she had to play the widow, she would play the widow. If she had to play the whore, she would do that too, though the thought made her stomach turn. She turned down the wick of the lamp, plunging the room into shadow. Outside, the storm finally broke, and the rain began to lash against the glass like handfuls of gravel. Evelyn lay down on the lumpy mattress, listening to the violence of the world outside, and began to plan her next move. The McAllister spread was an unforgiving stretch of territory that seemed to resent the cattle grazing upon it. The grass was thin and brittle, snapping like dry bones underfoot, and the earth was packed so hard that a man had to swing a pick with the force of a blacksmith to break the surface. It was a land of extremes, where the sky could hang overhead like a vast, empty sheet of pale blue silk for days, only to bruise purple and unleash a violent thunder that shook the fillings in a man's teeth within minutes. Jesse Cole had spent the last 4 days out on the northern ridge, repairing fences that the wind had torn down as if they were made of thread. His hands were raw, the calluses split and weeping blood, and his back ached with a dull, throbbing rhythm that matched the hoofbeats of his horse. The work was brutal, but it was honest, and usually, the exhaustion was enough to keep his mind empty. But not this week. Every time he drove a post or stretched a line of barbed wire, his mind drifted back to the woman he had pulled from the cliff. Evelyn Hart. The memory of her wrist in his hand, the desperate heat of her body against his back on the ride to town, plagued him. It was a distraction he could not afford, yet it clung to him like burrs to a saddle blanket. He rode into Dry Creek just as the afternoon sun began to slant, casting long, distorted shadows across the dust. He washed up at the pump behind the livery, scrubbing the red grit from his neck, and made his way toward the boarding house. He told himself he was just checking to see if she had settled her bill, or if she needed help moving on. He did not let himself admit he just wanted to see her eyes again. When he reached the porch of Mrs. Gable's establishment, he heard voices raised inside the parlor. The front door was open to catch the breeze, and the conversation drifted out, sharp and unpleasant. "I'm telling you, Mrs. Hart, I have no need for extra hands. Mrs." Gable's voice was like a saw cutting through dry wood. "My girl does the cleaning, and I do the cooking. I can scrub floors," Evelyn's voice replied. It was lower, controlled, but Jesse could hear the strain in it. "I can wash linens. I am not afraid of hard labor. I only need enough to pay for my room until I can arrange travel." "Mrs. Gable snorted. "I have seen how you walk, Mrs. Hart, and I have seen the dresses in your trunk. Black silk and lace. Those are not the clothes of a woman who scrubs floors. I run a respectable house. I do not need no fancy widow turning the men's heads and causing trouble under my roof." There was a silence, heavy and cold. "Is that what you think I am?" Evelyn asked softly. "Trouble? I think a woman alone, looking the way you do, brings a certain kind of attention." "Mrs." Gable said, "and I will not have it. You have paid through the week. After that, unless you have coin, the room goes to a paying customer." Jesse stepped through the doorway then, his boots heavy on the floorboards. Both women turned. Mrs. Gable looked annoyed. Evelyn looked cornered. Her face was pale, her gray eyes flashing with a mixture of humiliation and defiance. "Good evening, ladies," Jesse said, tipping his hat. "Mr. Cole, Mrs." Gable said, smoothing her apron. "I was just explaining the rules of the house to Mrs. Hart. I heard," Jesse said. His voice was calm, but his eyes were hard as flint as he looked at the older woman. "It seems to me a widow trying to earn her keep is about as respectable as it gets." "Mrs." Gable sniffed, not backing down but shifting her gaze. "I know my business. Mr. Cole, and I know trouble when I see it." She turned and marched back toward the kitchen, leaving them alone in the dusty foyer. Evelyn let out a breath she seemed to have been holding for a long time. She looked at Jesse, and for a second, the mask slipped. He saw a profound weariness in her posture. "You have a habit of appearing when the ground is giving way beneath me." "Mr. Cole," she said. Jesse looked at her. She was wearing the same black dress, but she had brushed it clean. The severe color should have made her look plain, but instead, it only made her skin look like cream and her mouth look redder. He looked away, focusing on the hat rack. "She is a hard woman," Jesse said, "but she is not the only voice in town. She made her feelings quite clear. Evelyn said, she suspects I am not entirely wholesome." Jesse shifted his weight. "If you need work, you might try the general store. Mrs. Avery is stern, but she is fair. Her husband has the gout and cannot climb the ladders like he used to. They might need help stocking or taking in mending." Evelyn hesitated. She looked down at her hands. They were smooth, white hands, not the hands of a woman who worked a farm or scrubbed floors. Jesse noticed the hesitation. "Honest work pays little," Evelyn said quietly. "It will take me months to save enough for a stagecoach ticket west." "It pays money," Jesse said, "and it buys you time. Unless you have another trade." Evelyn looked up at him sharply. Her eyes searched his face, looking for judgment. She found only simple practicality. "No," she said, "no other trade. I will try the store." The next day, Jesse watched from across the street as Evelyn walked into Avery's General Mercantile. She emerged an hour later, not smiling, but walking with a purpose. She got the job, but it was not an easy victory. Mrs. Avery, a woman with a face like a dried apple and a heart to match, had looked Evelyn up and down with the same suspicion as Mrs. Gable. She gave her the tasks no one else wanted. For the next few days, Evelyn spent her hours in the dim, dusty aisles of the store. She counted tins of beans, swept the rough plank floors until her back screamed, and stood behind the counter measuring out flour and sugar. She was careful. She kept her eyes down. She spoke only when spoken to, using a soft, deferential tone that she had practiced in front of mirrors years ago. She was the picture of the grieving, humble widow. But Dry Creek was a town of men, miners, drifters, cowboys, and railroad workers. And men possess an instinct for certain things. When Evelyn reached up to the high shelf to retrieve a bolt of calico, the movement pulled the black fabric of her dress tight against her waist and the curve of her hip. When she walked across the floor, even in her sensible boots, there was a natural, fluid grace to her movement that the other women in town did not possess. It was a sway, a rhythm, something inherent in her bones. Younger men began to find excuses to buy tobacco or nails they did not need. They lingered at the counter, watching her wrap packages with her long, dexterous fingers. "Afternoon, ma'am," a young ranch hand named Toby said, leaning his elbows on the counter. "You are new in town, ain't you?" "I am," Evelyn said, not looking up as she tied the string around a parcel of coffee. "Mighty fine to see a new face." Toby grinned, especially one so pleasant. Evelyn froze for a heartbeat. The tone was innocent enough, but the look in his eyes was familiar. It triggered a flash of memory so vivid she could smell the cigar smoke. St. Louis, the plush velvet of a hotel bar. Her husband, Silas, gripping her arm just tight enough to bruise. Smile at him. Evie, lean in close, make him feel like a king, and he will play like a fool. She pushed the memory down, boxing it up and sliding it into the dark corners of her mind. Here is your coffee. Sir, she said, sliding the package across the wood. That will be 15 cents. She kept her face blank, her voice flat. She was determined to be invisible, but she knew, with a sinking dread, that invisibility was a luxury she could not afford and a skill she did not possess. One evening, the sky turned a deep, bloody crimson as the sun died behind the western hills. The wind had died down, leaving a strange, heavy silence over the valley. Jesse finished his shift at the livery, where he had been helping the smith shoe a team of mules, and walked toward the edge of town. He found Evelyn at the small cemetery behind the church. It was a bleak patch of ground, enclosed by a falling-down picket fence. The grave markers were mostly wooden crosses, bleached gray by the sun, with a few stone slabs for the town's founding families. Evelyn was standing before a nameless marker, her arms wrapped around herself as if she were cold, though the evening air was still warm. The red light of the sunset bathed her in a surreal, violent glow. Jesse approached slowly, his boots crunching in the dry grass. She did not turn, but he knew she heard him. Evening, Evelyn, he said softly. Jesse, she acknowledged. Her voice was thick. You did not come to supper, he said. I was not hungry. She stared at the wooden cross. It belonged to a drifter who had died the winter before, but she seemed to be seeing something else entirely. Is it your husband? Jesse asked. Are you thinking of him? Evelyn let out a short, bitter laugh. It was a jarring sound in the quiet graveyard. I lied to you. Jesse, she said. Jesse went still. About what? About how he died? She said. She turned to face him. Her face was illuminated by the red light, making her eyes look almost black. It was not a wagon accident. There was no noble struggle against the elements. Jesse waited. He did not judge. He simply waited. We were in a rail town in Kansas. She said, the words spilling out fast. He had been drinking for 3 days. He got into a fight over a card game. He said the dealer cheated him. He was shouting, waving a pistol. He stumbled out into the rail yard. He was so drunk he did not hear the shunting engine. She closed her eyes. He fell onto the tracks. It was not quick, and it was not an accident. It was the end of a long, ugly road. She looked at Jesse, her expression raw. I told you it was an accident because I wanted to be the tragic widow. I wanted dignity. But the truth is, I felt nothing when he died. Nothing but relief. And now the guilt of that relief is eating me alive. Jesse looked at her, and he felt a cracking in his own chest. He stepped closer. The wind stirred the dust around their boots. There is no shame in relief. Evelyn, he said, his voice rough. When my Mary died, toward the end, the fever was so bad, she was screaming in her sleep. When she finally went quiet, the first thing I felt was not sadness. It was thanks. Thanks that the suffering was done. I hated myself for it for a long year, but it is just human. Evelyn looked at him, surprised by the admission. You loved her, more than I knew how to say. Jesse said, but you were glad she was gone. I was glad she was at peace. Jesse corrected. Just as you are glad your struggle is over. Your husband. He sounds like he carried a heavy weight, and he made you carry it too. You do not have to carry it anymore. The distance between them seemed to vanish. The harsh lines of the frontier town faded, leaving only the two of them in the bloody light. Evelyn looked up at him, her lips slightly parted. The wind blew a strand of dark hair across her cheek. Without thinking, Jesse raised his hand. He reached out, his rough, calloused fingers hovering inches from her face, intending to brush the hair away. It was a gesture of intimacy, of tenderness that terrified him. Evelyn did not pull away. She leaned in, just a fraction of an inch, her eyes searching his. The air between them crackled with a sudden, sharp current of desire. It was not the predatory lust of the men in the store. It was a recognition of shared brokenness. Then, the church bell tolled the hour, a mournful clang that shattered the moment. Jesse pulled his hand back as if he had touched a hot stove. He cleared his throat. Stepping back, "It is getting late," he said. his voice tight. "You should get back to the boarding house." Evelyn blinked, the spell broken. She looked at him, and he saw a flash of disappointment in her eyes before the mask slid back into place. "Yes," she said. "You are right. Good night, Jesse. Good night, Evelyn." He watched her walk away, her black silhouette cutting through the red twilight, and he felt a profound sense of loss, as if he had just let something precious slip through his fingers. 3 nights later, the wind was howling again, driving men into the shelter of the dusty Spur saloon. The room was thick with the smell of stale beer, unwashed bodies, and cheap tobacco smoke. A piano player in the corner was hammering out a tune that had been popular 10 years ago. The notes tinny and discordant. Jesse stood at the bar, nursing a glass of whiskey. He was tired, but the bunkhouse was too quiet, and his thoughts were too loud. Evelyn had come in earlier, sent by Mrs. Avery to deliver a message to the owner about a shipment of spirits. She stood near the door, looking out of place in her dark dress, waiting for the barkeep to acknowledge her. At a table near the center of the room, a card game was in progress. 4 men sat around a scarred table, money piled in the center. One of them, a man in a velvet vest with a waxed mustache and eyes like polished coal, looked up as the door opened. His name was Rafe Nolan. He was a drifting gambler, a man who made his living reading faces and dealing from the bottom of the deck. He looked at Evelyn, and his hands paused in their shuffle. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face. "Well, I will be damned," Rafe said, his voice cutting through the murmur of the room. He stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floorboards. He took 3 steps toward the door. "If it is not Lena Cross," Rafe announced. The room went quiet. The name meant nothing to most, but the tone implied everything. Evelyn froze. Her back went rigid. She did not turn around. "I believe you are mistaken, sir," she said, her voice tight. "My name is Evelyn Hart." Rafe laughed. It was a dry, hacking sound. "Hart? Is that the name you are using now? That is rich. Tell me, Lena, where is that husband of yours? Old Silas? Did he finally drink himself into a grave? Or is he waiting outside to mark the cards while you distract the boys?" Jesse set his glass down on the bar. The sound was sharp. He turned slowly. "You are speaking to a lady," he said, his voice low and dangerous. Rafe turned his gaze to Jesse. He looked the cowboy up and down with amusement. "A lady," Rafe sneered. "Friend, you have been out in the sun too long. This here is Lena Cross, best roper in Kansas City." "Roper?" a man at the bar asked. "Bait," Rafe clarified, raising his voice so the whole room could hear. "She works the room. She smiles. She brushes up against you. She whispers sweet promises in your ear until you are so distraction blind you do not notice her husband dealing seconds. I lost $200 to their little act in Abilene. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. The curiosity that had followed Evelyn turned into something uglier. It became judgment. It became crude amusement. Men who had looked at her with longing now looked at her with a knowing smirk. "So that is why she walks that way," one man muttered. "I knew a widow was too good to be true," another chuckled. Evelyn turned slowly to face the room. Her face was burning, a deep, humiliated flush that rose from her neck to her hairline. She looked at Rafe, and for a moment, Jesse saw pure rage in her eyes. But beneath the rage, there was a terrified recognition. He was telling the truth. "Is this true?" Jesse asked. He looked at her, pleading with his eyes for her to deny it, to tell him this gambler was a liar. Evelyn looked at Jesse. She opened her mouth, but no words came. The silence stretched, damning her more than any confession could. Rafe stepped closer, grinning. "Do not look so heartbroken. Cowboy, she is a fine-looking woman. If you have the coin, I am sure she—" Jesse moved before the sentence was finished. He shoved Rafe hard in the chest, sending the gambler stumbling back into a table. Drinks spilled. Cards fluttered to the floor. "Shut your mouth," Jesse snarled. Rafe regained his balance, his hand hovering near the derringer he kept in his vest. But he looked at Jesse's eyes that promised violence, and he laughed instead. "Have it your way, hero. But do not say I did not warn you. You are saving a siren, not a saint. Jessie turned to Evelyn. Her head was bowed, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. The room was watching them, 100 eyes judging, stripping her bare. Come on, Jessie said roughly. He took her arm, not gently this time, but with a firm grip, and steered her out of the saloon. The doors swung shut behind them, cutting off the laughter that had started to bubble up. The street was dark and cold. The wind hit them instantly, drying the sweat on Jessie's face. He walked fast, forcing Evelyn to keep pace. They did not speak. The silence between them was brittle, ready to shatter. Jessie's mind was reeling. Bait, a roper. He thought of the way she had looked on the cliff. The fear. Was that real? Or was it just another performance? He thought of the moment in the graveyard. The almost touch. Had she been playing him then, too, measuring him for a mark? They reached the boarding house porch. Jessie let go of her arm. She rubbed the spot where his fingers had dug in. Evelyn, Jessie said, the name tasted like ash in his mouth. Or is it Lena? Evelyn looked up at him. In the moonlight, her face was a mask of misery. My middle name is Elena, she whispered. Lena is what they called me in the life. So it is true. Jessie said, everything he said. You and your husband. You cheated men. We survived. Evelyn hissed. The sudden anger in her voice surprised him. She stepped closer, her eyes blazing. Do you think I chose that? Do you think I woke up a girl and dreamed of being a lure for a drunkard's scams? She took a breath, her voice shaking. Silas beat me. Jessie, if I did not smile at the right men, if I did not make them sit at the table, he would use his belt. If we did not win, we did not eat. Yes, I learned how to look at a man. I learned how to lean close. I learned how to make a heart hammer because my life depended on it. She grabbed the lapels of his coat. I was 18. I was terrified. And I was good at it because I had to be. Jessie stared at her. He saw the truth in her anguish. He believed the fear. But the image Rafe had painted, the woman leaning over a table, using her beauty as a weapon, stuck in his gut like a knife. It was jealousy, hot and irrational. He hated that other men had known her this way. He hated that she knew how to manipulate desire so well that he couldn't tell what was real and what was the game. And now? Jessie asked, his voice harsh. Are you trying to survive now? Was the graveyard a game? Was the cliff? Evelyn recoiled as if he had slapped her. Tears welled in her eyes, spilling over. I am trying to be decent. She sobbed. I am trying to start over. I buried Lena Cross with him. But you people will not let her stay dead. She looked at him, searching for the tenderness he had shown before, but Jessie was walled off, his own hurt making him cruel. A leopard does not change its spots. Ma'am, Jessie said, and a hustler does not forget the trade. He saw the light go out of her eyes. She dropped her hands from his coat and stepped back. Good night, Mr. Cole, she said. Her voice was dead. Good night, Jessie replied. He turned and walked away into the darkness. He did not look back. If he had, he would have seen her standing there, shivering, not from the cold, but from the crushing weight of being known and rejected. Jessie walked until his legs burned. He was angry at Rafe, angry at the town, angry at Evelyn, but mostly he was angry at himself, because even now, knowing what she was, knowing the lies and the manipulation, he could still feel the phantom touch of her hand. He still wanted her, and that terrified him more than any gunfight ever had. Alone in room 4, Evelyn locked the door. She moved mechanically, stripping off the black veil and the heavy dress. She stood in her chemise before the cracked mirror. She looked at her reflection. She traced the line of her jaw, the curve of her lips. Lena Cross. The name whispered in her mind. Lena was strong. Lena knew how to handle men like Rafe Nolan. Lena would have laughed in his face, poured a drink on his boots, and had the whole room eating out of her hand by midnight. Evelyn Hart was weak. Evelyn Hart was trying to be good in a world that rewarded the bad. She opened her trunk. At the bottom, wrapped in oilcloth, was a dress of red silk. It was cut low, designed to draw the eye and hold it. It was a tool of her old trade. She touched the silk. It was cool and smooth. It would be so easy. She could walk into that saloon tomorrow wearing this. She could find a protector. Silas Caro, the rancher everyone spoke of in hushed tones. She had seen him ride through town. A man like that would pay for a woman like Lena. She could have safety. She could have food. She could have power. All she had to do was kill the part of her that wanted Jessie Cole to look at her with respect. She stared at the mirror, her eyes hard and wet. "No," she whispered. She slammed the trunk lid shut. She would not go back, not yet. She would fight. She would scrub floors until her knees bled. She would prove them wrong. But as she blew out the lamp and lay in the dark, the doubt curled in her belly like a snake. The Temptress was still there, waiting in the dark, reminding her that survival was the only thing that mattered, and that love was just a pretty lie people told themselves before they died. Silas Caro returned to Dry Creek like a drought breaking, though his arrival brought no relief, only a shifting of the weight that pressed down on the town. He was a man built of heavy bones and heavier appetites. The owner of the Double Bar Ranch, a sprawling empire of dust and sagebrush that held a stranglehold on the valley's water rights. He had been away in Denver on business, buying politicians and selling beef, and his return signaled that the town's brief respite from his watchful eye was over. He rode into town in a carriage polished to a high shine, indifferent to the red dust that coated its wheels. He was a man in his 50s, with a face that looked as though it had been carved from granite and then left out in the rain to weather. His eyes were small, dark, and set deep beneath a brow that permanently shadowed them. He did not look at people when he passed. He looked through them, assessing their value and their debt. It was near the livery stable that he first saw Evelyn Hart. She was walking from the general store, carrying a parcel of brown paper. The wind was up, as it always seemed to be, pressing her black skirts against her legs and teasing loose a strand of hair from her severe bun. She held her head high, her gaze fixed on the middle distance, ignoring the stares of the men loitering on the boardwalk. Silas pulled on the reins, bringing his team of grays to a halt. He watched her. He did not see a grieving widow. He saw the line of her neck, the way her hips moved beneath the heavy fabric, the practiced control in her walk. He had spent enough time in the velvet-draped parlors of Denver and San Francisco to know the difference between a woman who was naturally modest and a woman who was playing a role. He watched her pass, his gaze lingering on the faint shadow of her lips, which looked as though they had been bitten to bring color to them. He smiled, a slow stretching of thin lips. It was a look of recognition. Game recognized game. That evening, the sun dipped below the horizon in a blaze of orange, leaving the air swiftly chilling toward freezing. Winter was coming early to the high desert. Evelyn was in her room at the boarding house, counting the coins in her small purse. She had $3.40. The rent was due in 2 days. Mrs. Gable had made it clear there would be no grace period. The work at the general store paid a pittance, barely enough to cover her meals, let alone save for a ticket out of this purgatory. A knock came at her door. It was Mrs. Avery's boy, a freckled youth with dirt under his fingernails. "Message for you." "Ma'am," the boy said, handing her a folded piece of heavy, cream-colored paper. Evelyn took it. The handwriting was bold, aggressive. "Mrs. Hart, I have need of a hostess for a private game of cards this evening at my ranch. The company is refined, but the service in this town is lacking. I require someone with a steady hand and a pleasant demeanor to pour drinks and keep the atmosphere congenial. $10 for the evening. My driver waits downstairs. Silas Caro. $10. It was a fortune. It was a month of safety. It was a ticket halfway to California. Evelyn stared at the paper. Her stomach tightened, a cold knot of dread forming in her gut. She knew what hostess meant. She knew what keep the atmosphere congenial meant. It was a polite invitation to step back into the pit she had just crawled out of. She went downstairs. The note crunched in her hand. Mrs. Avery was in the parlor, delivering linens. She saw the paper and the waiting carriage outside. "Do not go, Mrs." Avery said, her voice low and urgent. Evelyn looked at the older woman. Why? Because Silas Caro does not hire help. Mrs., Avery said. He buys things, and he does not like to let go of what he buys. That man has a graveyard in his eyes. Child, you stay here. We will find another way for the rent. Evelyn looked out the window at the darkening street. The wind rattled the pane, a reminder of the cold that was coming. She thought of the $3 in her purse. She thought of Mrs. Gable's sneer. She thought of the hunger that had gnawed at her belly for years before she met her husband, and the hunger that had followed her after. Honesty is a luxury for the fed. Mrs. Avery, Evelyn said softly. She put on her shawl, pinning it tight against the cold, and walked out to the carriage. The main house of the Double Bar Ranch was a testament to Silas Caro's vanity. It was built of stone and timber, 2 stories high, with glass windows imported from the east and rugs that muffled the sound of boots. But for all its finery, it smelled of the same dust and raw masculinity as the bunkhouse. The poker game was set up in the main parlor. A fire roared in the stone hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls. 4 men sat around the mahogany table. Silas sat at the head, a cigar clamped between his teeth, dealing the cards with thick, steady fingers. The other men were local cattle barons and the town judge, men of influence, men who held the law in one hand and a whiskey glass in the other. When Evelyn entered, the conversation stopped. "Gentlemen," Silas said, not looking up from his shuffle, "allow me to introduce Mrs. Hart. She will be ensuring our glasses remain full this evening." Evelyn stood in the doorway. She had removed her veil. She had pinched her cheeks to bring life to them. She took a breath, and then, like a soldier stepping onto a battlefield, she let the mask slip into place. She lowered her chin just enough to look up through her lashes. She relaxed her shoulders, letting the shawl slip to reveal the curve of her neck. She walked into the room not with the stiff gait of a widow, but with the fluid, silent grace of a woman who knows exactly where every man in the room is looking. "Good evening, gentlemen," she said. Her voice was an octave lower than usual, smooth as warm honey. "I hope the cards are treating you well." She moved to the sideboard and lifted the crystal decanter. She felt a wave of nausea roll through her, a physical rejection of the role. But her hands were steady. She poured. She served. As the hours wore on, the air grew thick with blue smoke and the smell of spirits. Evelyn circled the table. She learned quickly which men liked to smile, which liked a soft touch on the shoulder when she refilled a glass, and which liked to be ignored. Silas watched her. He barely spoke to her, but his eyes were always on her. It was a proprietary look, heavy and suffocating. Evelyn hated him. She hated the smell of the cigar smoke that clung to her hair. She hated the sound of their laughter, crude and wet. But the temptation of the old power was there, insidious and familiar. She saw the way the judge stammered when she leaned in to pour his bourbon. She saw the way the cattlemen puffed out their chests when she laughed at their jokes. It was a power she had wielded for her husband for years. It was a weapon. And right now, it was the only one she had. Outside, the wind howled around the stone corners of the house. Jesse Cole rode into the ranch yard just past 10 o'clock. He was leading a string of 4 horses that McAllister had sold to Caro. The ride had been cold. His hands were numb inside his gloves, and he was in a foul mood. He wanted to drop the horses, collect the payment note, and ride back to his bunk. He handed the reins to a stable hand and walked up to the main house. The foreman had told him to go to the parlor to get the signature from Silas. Jesse stomped the mud off his boots on the porch and pushed open the heavy oak door. The warmth of the house hit him, carrying the scent of tobacco and expensive whiskey. He walked down the hall to the open parlor doors. "Mr. Caro, I have the words died in his throat. He stood in the doorway, his hat in his hands, staring at the scene before him. Evelyn was standing behind the judge's chair. She was laughing at something the man had said, her head thrown back, her neck exposed to the firelight. One hand rested lightly, almost intimately, on the back of the judge's chair. Her cheeks were flushed, her eyes were bright and hard. She looked exactly like the woman Rafe Nolan had described. She looked like a siren. Jesse felt a physical blow to his chest, sharp and breathless. It was not just surprise, it was a hot, twisting knife of betrayal. He had defended her. He had believed in her fear. And here she was, gliding through the smoke like she had been born in it, serving drinks to the very men who made the world a hell for people like him. Evelyn looked up and saw him. Her laughter cut off instantly. The glass in her hand trembled, the amber liquid sloshing against the crystal. Her eyes met his, and for a second, the mask shattered. He saw the shame, the panic, the plea for understanding, but Jesse's face was stone. He looked at her with a cold, condemning stare that stripped the dignity right off her bones. "Well, look who it is," Silas said, leaning back in his chair and exhaling a cloud of smoke. "The knight in shining leather. Put the bill on the desk. Cole, Mrs. Hart, pour the man a drink." "He looks like he has swallowed a bug." "I am not thirsty," Jesse said. His voice was like grinding gravel. He walked to the desk, slammed the bill of sale down, and turned to leave. He could not look at her again. If he did, he might do something reckless. "Wait," Silas commanded. Silas stood up. He was a big man, taller than Jesse and broader, with the thickness of a bull. He walked over to Evelyn, who was standing frozen by the sideboard. "You have not been properly introduced," Silas said, a cruel amusement dancing in his eyes. "Though I hear you two are already acquainted, Mrs. Hart here is a woman of many talents. Isn't that right?" "Evelyn." Silas reached out and ran his knuckles down Evelyn's bare arm, from her shoulder to her elbow. It was a possessive, claiming touch. Evelyn flinched. She pulled her arm away, stepping back until she hit the wall. "Don't," she whispered. Silas chuckled. He turned his back on Jesse, dismissing him, and moved into the small side room where the liquor cabinet stood, beckoning Evelyn to follow. "Bring the other bottle. Evelyn. The good stuff." Evelyn looked at Jesse one last time, a look of desperate terror, before she lowered her head and followed Silas into the side room, out of sight of the poker table but not out of earshot. Jesse stood rooted to the spot. His pride told him to walk away. His anger told him she was getting what she wanted, but his gut told him something was wrong. From the side room, he heard the clink of glass, then a low murmur of voices. "You are a fine thing," Silas's voice drifted out, low and oily. "I saw you in town. I knew what you were the moment I saw you walk. You have the look of a woman who knows how to please a man. Please, Mr. Caro." Evelyn's voice was shaking now. "The honey gone. I'm only here to serve the drinks." "You are here because I own this town," Silas said. "And you are a grifter with a debt." "I know about the rent. I know about the marshal asking questions." There was a sound of movement, a rustle of silk, and then a sharp gasp. "I can make the marshal go away," Silas said. "I can pay your rent for a year, or I can have you thrown in a cell by morning for fraud. All you have to do is be nice. Work for me. Exclusively. In this house. In my room." "No," Evelyn said. The word was a sob. "Let me go," Silas laughed. "You do not have anywhere to go. Darling, you are mine. Now stop fighting." There was the sound of a struggle, a chair scraping, a glass shattering on the floor, and a cry of pain. Jesse did not think. The red haze that had been clouding his vision since he walked in snapped into a singular, crystalline focus. He crossed the parlor in 3 long strides. The judge shouted something, but Jesse ignored him. He kicked the door to the side room fully open. Silas had Evelyn pressed up against the bookshelf. One of his large hands was wrapped around her upper arm, his fingers digging into the flesh. The other was tangled in her hair, pulling her head back. Evelyn was clawing at his wrist, her face twisted in pain. "Get your hands off her!" Jesse roared. Silas turned, surprise registering on his heavy face. He did not let go. "Get out of here, cowboy," Silas snarled. "This is none of your concern." Jesse stepped forward, grabbed Silas by the lapels of his expensive coat, and threw him backward. The rancher stumbled, releasing Evelyn, and crashed into a small table, sending a lamp skittering dangerously close to the edge. Silas roared in outrage, his face turning a mottled purple. He regained his balance and lunged, but Jesse was faster. He shoved Silas again, hard, slamming him back against the wall. I said, "Hands off," Jesse said. His hand hovered over the butt of his Colt. He did not draw it, but the threat was there, vibrating in the air. Evelyn was gasping for air, clutching her bruised arm. Her hair was half torn from its pins, hanging wild around her face. Silas straightened his coat. He looked at Jesse, and the amusement was gone, replaced by a cold, reptilian hatred. "You are making a mistake." "Cole," Silas said softly, "a big one. You are risking your livelihood for a used woman, a whore who played you for a fool." "She is leaving," Jesse said. "Now," Silas sneered. "She walks out that door. She's finished in this town. And you will never work a herd in this county again. I will bury you both." Jesse looked at Silas with pure disgust. "You can try." He turned to Evelyn. "Go!" Evelyn did not wait. She gathered her skirts and ran. She fled through the parlor, past the stunned poker players, and out the front door into the biting night. Jesse backed out of the room, keeping his eyes on Silas until he was in the hallway. Then he turned and followed her. He found her near the corral. She was leaning against the rough wooden fence, retching dryly into the dust. The cold air was a shock after the heat of the house. Her breath came in white clouds that vanished instantly in the wind. Jesse walked up to her. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind the sour taste of the anger he had felt earlier. "Evelyn," he said. She spun around. Her eyes were wide, frantic. She looked like a trapped animal. "Why did you come?" she cried. Her voice was shrill. "You should have left me." Jesse stopped a few feet away. He looked at her, the disheveled hair, the red silk peeking out from under her shawl, the bruise already darkening on her arm. "Is this what you wanted?" he asked. His voice was harsh, unforgiving. "You told me you wanted to be decent, and then I find you here, playing the same game Rafe talked about, prancing around for men like Silas Caro." "I had no choice," Evelyn screamed. The sound tore from her throat, raw and ragged. "There is always a choice," Jesse shouted back. "You could have scrubbed floors. You could have starved. But you chose the easy way. You chose to be what they say you are." "The easy way?" Evelyn laughed. A hysterical, broken sound. She stepped toward him, poking him in the chest with a shaking finger. "You think this is easy? You think I like the smell of their sweat? You think I like being handled like livestock? I think you are good at it." Jesse said, "I saw you in there. You looked like you belonged." Evelyn slapped him. It was not a hard slap, but the sound cracked like a whip in the cold air. She stared at him, her chest heaving, tears streaming down her face, cutting tracks through the powder she had applied. "I was groomed." "Jesse," she sobbed. The fight went out of her, and she slumped against the fence. "I was 16. Silas, my husband. He found me in an orphanage. He told me he loved me. He bought me dresses. He taught me how to speak. And then he taught me how to be bait." She slid down the fence until she was sitting in the dirt, heedless of the cold. "He beat me if I did not smile," she whispered. "He held a gun to my head once because I refused to sit on a mark's lap. I did not design the scams. I was the tool. I was the key they used to unlock the doors." She looked up at the stars, which were sharp as needles in the black sky. "And then in Kansas, the mark figured it out. He pulled a knife, my husband. He pushed me in the way. He used me as a shield. The man lunged, and the gun went off. I don't even know who pulled the trigger, but the man died. And my husband ran, and I ran." She looked at Jesse, her face a mask of tragedy. "I am not running from a debt. Jesse, I am running from a hanging. I am running from the memory of a man bleeding out on a floor while my husband checked his pockets. That is who I am. That is what I am hiding." Jesse stood over her. The silence of the prairie stretched out around them, enormous and empty. The wind sighed through the fence rails. He looked at the woman huddled in the dirt. He stripped away the red dress, the saloon makeup, the rumors. He saw the 16-year-old girl who had been sold a lie. He saw the survivor who had endured hell and was still trying to stand. The anger drained out of him, leaving a hollow ache. He felt ashamed of his judgment. He had looked at her with the same eyes as Silas, seeing the surface, not the soul. He knelt down in the dirt. He reached out and took her hands. They were freezing. "Evelyn," he said softly. She tried to pull away. "Don't. I am dirty. Jesse, I am all the things you hate." Jesse did not let go. He pulled her toward him. "Look at me." She raised her tear-stained face. "I see you," he said. "I see you." He reached up and cupped her face. His thumb brushed away a tear that was tracking toward her jaw. Her skin was cold, but her eyes were burning with a desperate need. He leaned in and kissed her. It was rough at first, born of the violence of the night and the adrenaline still coursing through his veins. But then she made a small, broken sound against his mouth, and the kiss changed. It became aching. It became gentle. It became a promise. For a moment, the cold vanished. The threat of Silas, the law, the winter, it all fell away. There was only the heat of her mouth, the desperate clutch of her hands on his coat, the feeling of two broken things fitting together to make something whole. Desire surged through Jesse, hot and terrifying. He wanted to pull her inside his coat, to shield her from the wind and the world. He wanted to take her away from this place, to a land where no one knew her name. Evelyn clung to him like a drowning woman. She tasted of salt and fear. For the first time in years, she let herself feel the want. She let herself be held not as a prize, but as a person. Then, the reality crashed back in. She pulled back suddenly, gasping for air. She scrambled backward in the dirt, putting distance between them. "No," she whispered. "No, Evelyn." Jesse reached for her. "You cannot," she said, her voice shaking. "You cannot do this. I will drag you down. Jesse, Silas is right. I am poison. If you stand with me, you will lose everything. The town will turn on you. The law will come for you." "I do not care." Jesse said. "I do," she cried. "I care. You are the only decent thing I have found in this wretched life. I will not be the one to ruin you." She scrambled to her feet. She wrapped her shawl tight around herself, hiding the red dress, hiding herself. "Do not come to me again. Jesse," she begged. "Please, for your own sake, let me figure this out. Let me go." She turned and ran toward the dark road that led back to town, a shadow moving against the shadows. Jesse stayed by the corral, kneeling in the dirt. He watched her go until the darkness swallowed her whole. His heart was hammering against his ribs, burning with a fire that the cold wind could not extinguish. He touched his lips where she had kissed him. He knew then, with the terrible clarity of a man who has looked over the edge of a cliff, that he could not let her go. He was already ruined. He was already hers, and he would burn the whole town down before he let Silas Caro touch her again. The poison of rumor moved faster than any fever through the veins of Dry Creek. It traveled on the dry wind that scraped down the main street, whispering through the cracks in the clapboard walls and settling into the dust on the saloon floor. Rafe Nolan was the primary carrier of the infection, the gambler, bruised from his encounter with Jesse Cole but emboldened by the town's growing suspicion, held court at the dusty spur. He sat with his boots propped on a chair, a bottle of cheap rye whiskey at his elbow, spinning tales that grew darker with every retelling. She went by Lena Cross in Abilene. Rafe told a table of eager listeners, his voice low and conspiratorial. And before that, she was in Dodge. They say she and that husband of hers took a cattle baron for $5,000. She lured him in, got him drunk on her smile, and then, snap, the trap closed. She is a spider. Gentlemen, a black widow who has not killed her mate yet because she needs him to carry the web. The men listened, their eyes glazed with a mixture of moral outrage and suppressed desire. It was a potent combination. They hated her for what she was, and they wanted her for the same reason. Silas Caro did not hold court in the saloon. He worked more quietly, standing on the steps of the church after the Sunday service, or leaning over the counter at the bank. He did not shout. He murmured. He spoke of civic duty and the danger of transient elements. "It is a shame," Silas would say, shaking his head with a heavy sigh. "A woman like that, preying on the charity of good Christian folk. I tried to offer her honest work at the ranch, just to get her off the street, but she made suggestions that a man of my standing could not entertain." The women of the town, who had initially been wary of Evelyn's beauty, now found a righteous cause to anchor their dislike. When Evelyn walked from the boarding house to the general store, the sidewalk cleared. Mothers pulled their children behind their skirts. The conversations on the porches died instantly, replaced by a silence that was louder than any shout. Mrs. Avery, pressured by the town council and the disapproving glares of her customers, told Evelyn she could no longer work at the store. Evelyn walked through this gauntlet with her head high, but her eyes were fixed on the ground 3 feet in front of her. She was a ghost haunting a town that wanted her exorcised. Dry Creek, with its ring of red, jagged rocks and dust-choked gullies, had become a prison. Every window was an eye, and every eye was judging. Then the law arrived. He rode in on a Wednesday, a man who looked as though he had been cut from the same leather as his saddle. Marshal Tom Riker was a territorial deputy, a man with a reputation for being as relentless as the summer sun and just as unfeeling. He rode a roan gelding that looked tired, and his dusters were coated in the gray grit of the trail. He tied his horse at the hitching rail outside the marshal's office, which had stood empty since the local sheriff died of a burst heart 2 months prior. Riker carried a leather satchel, and from it, he produced a sheaf of papers. Within an hour, a poster was tacked to the notice board outside the post office. It was a sketch, rough but skillful. The woman in the drawing had hair piled high and a smile that looked both inviting and dangerous. The name printed in bold block letters was not Evelyn Hart. It was Helena Crow. Beneath the name were the charges: fraud, larceny, suspicion of manslaughter. A crowd gathered. They pointed. They whispered. Silas Caro happened to be walking by. He stopped, adjusted his expensive hat, and squinted at the poster. Marshal Riker was standing nearby, lighting a pipe. "You recognize her?" Riker asked. His voice was gravel rolling in a tin can. Silas frowned, a performance of reluctant recognition. "It bears a striking resemblance to a woman staying at Mrs. Gable's boarding house." Silas said, "She calls herself Evelyn Hart, claims to be a widow." Riker nodded slowly. He puffed on his pipe, the smoke drifting away on the breeze. "Helena Crow is wanted in Kansas," Riker said. "A card game went bad in a rail town. A man was shot dead. Her husband, a man named Silas Hart, no relation to you, I assume, was the one holding the gun. But witnesses say she was the one who set the markup." "They ran before the law could settle the matter. It is a tragedy," Silas said smoothly, "to see a woman fall so low. But the law is the law, Marshal, and Dry Creek is a town of order. I will need to speak with her," Riker said. Silas placed a hand on the Marshal's shoulder. "Be careful, Marshal. She is a convincing actress. She has already fooled a few of our local boys into thinking she is a saint in mourning. I have been a lawman for 20 years. Mr. Caro," Riker said, his eyes cold and flat. "I am not easily fooled." Jesse Cole was repairing a cinch on his saddle outside the livery when he saw the marshal walking down the center of the street. Riker walked with a heavy, purposeful stride, his hand resting near the butt of his peacemaker, behind him, at a safe distance. A gaggle of townsfolk followed, eager for the spectacle. Jesse's stomach turned over. He dropped the saddle and stepped out into the street. He saw where Riker was headed, the boarding house. Jesse started to run, his boots thudding in the dirt, but he was too far away. He reached the edge of the crowd just as Riker stepped up onto the porch and hammered on the door. "Mrs." Gable opened it. She took one look at the marshal and the crowd, and she stepped aside, pointing a bony finger toward the stairs. "Room 4, she said loud enough for the street to hear. "I want her out. She has brought nothing but shame to this house." Jesse pushed his way to the front of the crowd. He saw Rafe Nolan grinning from the shadow of the saloon awning. He saw Silas Caro watching from the steps of the bank, his face a mask of solemn satisfaction. Moments later, the door reopened. Riker came out first. His hand was gripping Evelyn's upper arm. She was not wearing her veil. Her face was pale, stripped of all color, making her eyes look like dark bruises. Her wrists were crossed in front of her, bound by steel handcuffs that glinted in the harsh sunlight. The sound of the chain clinking against the metal was a terrible, final sound. Evelyn stumbled slightly on the steps, her heavy skirts dragging in the dust. She did not look at the crowd. She did not look at the jeering men or the whispering women. She looked straight ahead, her jaw set in a line of grim resignation. "There she is," someone shouted. "The widow spider." "Hang her," another voice cried out, emboldened by the mob. Jesse surged forward. He ducked under the hitching rail and stepped into the street, blocking Riker's path. "Hold on," Jesse said. His voice was steady, but his hands were shaking with rage. "You cannot just drag her out like this. What is the meaning of this? Marshal?" Riker stopped. He looked at Jesse, sizing him up. He saw the worn clothes, the low-slung gun, the desperate eyes. "Step aside, son," Riker said. "This woman is under arrest by the authority of the Kansas Territory." "For what?" Jesse demanded. "Murder," Riker said flatly, "or near enough to it. Now step aside, or I will arrest you for obstruction." Jesse looked at Evelyn. She finally lifted her eyes to meet his. He expected to see a plea for help, but instead, he saw a quiet, devastating goodbye. She shook her head slightly, a microscopic movement telling him to stand down. "Do not," she whispered. Her voice was barely audible over the wind. "Please, Jesse, do not." Jesse stood frozen. If he drew his gun, he would be dead in 3 seconds. Riker was a professional, and half the town was armed. If he fought now, he died, and she was left alone. He stepped back. It was the hardest thing he had ever done. He stepped back and let them pass. He watched as Riker marched her down the center of the street toward the small stone building that served as the jail. He watched the dust swirl around her, dragging him. He watched the town of Dry Creek tear her apart with their eyes, stripping away her dignity until she was nothing but a cautionary tale in black silk. The jail was a single room of stone and mortar, smelling of damp earth, stale tobacco, and old fear. There were 2 cells in the back, barred with iron that had rusted to the color of dried blood. Evelyn sat on the narrow wooden bench in the cell on the left. Riker sat at the desk in the outer office, filling out paperwork by the light of a kerosene lamp. The sun had set, and the wind was picking up outside, moaning around the corners of the building like a grieving woman. Riker put down his pen and turned his chair to face the bars. "You want to tell me your side of it, Mrs. Crow?" he asked. Evelyn looked at her hands. The metal cuffs had left red chafing marks on her wrists. "My name is Hart," she said quietly. "Evelyn Hart. Helena Crow was a role." "And the dead man?" Riker asked. "Was he a role too?" Evelyn closed her eyes. She could still see the saloon in Kansas, the smoke, the sudden flash of the knife. "My husband was cheating," she said. "I did not know it until the cards were on the table. The man, Mr. Lewis, he caught Silas dealing from the bottom. He stood up. He had a knife." She took a breath, her voice trembling. "Silas pulled a gun. I tried to stop him. I grabbed his arm. I tried to pull the gun away. I screamed at him to stop. In the struggle, the gun went off. Mr. Lewis fell." "So you admit you were there," Riker said. "You admit you were part of the game." "I was the distraction." Evelyn said, "I admitted that, but I never wanted anyone to die. I tried to stop it." Riker rubbed his jaw. "Witnesses say you and your husband fled the scene. Innocent people do not run. Ma'am, scared people run," Evelyn whispered. "Women who know the law does not listen to the wife of a grifter run. Who would have believed me? Marshal? Who would have taken my word over the dead body of a local man?" Riker did not answer. He turned back to his paperwork. The silence in the jail was heavy, punctuated only by the scratching of his pen and the howling of the wind. Evelyn leaned her head back against the cold stone wall. She was tired. She was so tired that the fear had dulled into a gray numbness. It was past midnight when the door opened. The wind gusted in, blowing dust across the floor and making the lantern flame dance wildly. Jesse Cole stepped inside. He had his hat in his hand, and his face was drawn and pale. "Marshal," Jesse said. Riker looked up. He did not look surprised. "I figured you would come around. 5 minutes. Cole, and keep your hands where I can see them." Jesse nodded. He walked to the bars. The jail was dim, the single lantern casting long prison bar shadows across Evelyn's face. She looked small. The defiance that had held her upright on the cliff and in the saloon was gone. She looked like a child wearing a widow's costume. "Jesse," she breathed, "you shouldn't be here." Jesse gripped the cold iron bars. His knuckles turned white. "I am not leaving you in here. Evelyn, there is nowhere else to be," she said. Her voice was devoid of hope. "He has the warrant. He has the sketches. It is over." Jesse looked at her, his heart twisting in his chest. He saw the resignation in her posture, and it terrified him more than her anger ever had. "I spoke to Riker. Jesse said, he says the circuit judge is 2 days ride away. If we can get a lawyer." "A lawyer?" Evelyn laughed softly, a sound that broke his heart. "With what money? Jesse? And what defense? I was there. I lived off the money we stole. I am guilty of everything except pulling the trigger, and the law does not make much distinction when a man is dead." She stood up and walked to the bars. She stood so close he could smell the scent of her, fading rosewater and the dust of the cell. "I almost did it," she confessed, her voice a whisper. "Did what?" "Silas Caro," she said. She looked down, unable to meet his eyes. "That night at the ranch. Before you burst in, there was a moment where I thought about saying yes. I thought about letting him own me, because it would have been warm. It would have been safe. I would never have to be in a cage like this again." She looked up at him, tears swimming in her gray eyes. "I hate myself for that. Jesse, I hate that part of me that is so afraid of the cold that I would sell my soul to stay warm. The only time I felt like I was worth more than that was with you." Jesse felt a lump form in his throat, hard and painful. "When you looked at me on the cliff," Evelyn said, "when you looked at me in the graveyard, you did not look at me like a mark. You did not look at me like a whore. You looked at me like I was just a woman worth saving." Jesse reached through the bars. He did not care about Riker sitting 10 feet away. He did not care about the law. He cupped her face in his hands. Her skin was cold, but her tears were hot. "You are worth saving," Jesse said fiercely. "You are not just what they made you. You are the woman who fought on that cliff. You are the woman who told the truth in the dirt." He leaned his forehead against the iron bars, pressing as close as he could. She mirrored him, her forehead resting against his, the cold metal biting into their skin between them. "I wish I had met you a long time ago," Evelyn whispered. "In some gentler world, a world where I wasn't broken, where I could let you hold me without shame, where I could just be Evelyn, and you could just be Jesse, and we could have a front porch and a quiet life. We can still have that." Jesse said. "No," she said, "we can't, but thank you for wanting it." They closed the distance. Their lips met through the gap in the bars. It was a desperate, trembling kiss. It tasted of salt and iron and despair. It was the kiss of two people standing on the edge of a precipice, knowing the fall was coming. Jesse felt the fire of desire burn through him, sharp and agonizing because he could not reach her. He could not pull her close. The iron was stronger than his arms. Riker cleared his throat from the desk. "Time is up. Cole." They broke apart. Evelyn stepped back into the shadows of her cell. She looked like she was already fading away. "Goodbye, Jesse," she said. Jesse looked at her one last time. He memorized the line of her jaw, the sorrow in her eyes. "This is not goodbye," he said. He turned and walked out into the wind. Outside, the night was turning violent. The wind was whipping the sagebrush into a frenzy, and the air was thick with the taste of copper and grit. A dust storm was building on the horizon. a wall of brown earth rising to blot out the stars. Jesse stood on the boardwalk, staring at the jail. He felt helpless. He felt a rage burning in his gut that no amount of whiskey could drown. Marshal Riker stepped out onto the porch to lock the door. He saw Jesse standing there. The lawman paused, lighting a cheroot, shielding the flame with his hat. "You are a good man, Cole," Riker said. "I can see that, but you are thinking with your heart, not your head. She did not kill that man," Jesse said. "Maybe not," Riker said, "but she ran with the man who did. The law is a blunt instrument. Son, it does not cut fine." Riker took a drag of his smoke. He looked around to ensure the street was empty. Then he stepped closer to Jesse, lowering his voice. "You should know," Riker said. "Silas Caro came to see me an hour ago." Jesse stiffened. "What did he want?" "He made an offer," Riker said, his face twisting in distaste. "He said he would be willing to take custody of the prisoner. He said he has connections with the territorial judge. He could arrange for her sentence to be served under his supervision at his ranch." Jesse felt the blood drain from his face. "Custody? Indentured servitude is what it is," Riker spat. "Slavery in a fancy coat. He wants to keep her there. He says it is to keep her off the gallows, but we both know what he wants. He wants to break her." "And what did you say?" Jesse asked, his hands curling into fists. "I told him I would wait for the judge," Riker said. "But the judge is Caro's cousin by marriage. If I hold her here until the hearing, the judge will likely sign her over to him." "It is legal, Cole. Ugly as sin, but legal." Jesse stared at the marshal. He saw a man who was bound by rules that had been twisted by money. He saw a system that would take a woman like Evelyn, a victim of circumstance, and hand her back to a monster like Silas, all with a stamp of approval from the court. "So that is it?" Jesse asked. "She hangs, or she belongs to Silas." "That is the way of it," Riker said. "I am sorry. Son, go home. Get some sleep." Riker turned and went back inside, the heavy bolt sliding home with a final thud. Jesse stood alone in the street. The wind lashed at his face, stinging his eyes. He looked at the church steeple, dark and silent. He looked at the bank, where Silas's money sat safe in the vault. He looked at the jail, a stone box holding the only thing in the world that made him feel alive. The law, the church, the town. They had all failed. They were all complicit. They would punish Evelyn for surviving, and they would let Silas Caro walk free because he owned the land they stood on. The injustice of it gnawed at Jesse's bones. It burned hotter than his grief, hotter than his fear. He looked at the horizon. The wall of dust was closer now, blotting out the moon. The storm was coming. It would be blinding. It would be chaotic. It would cover tracks and hide sins. Jesse made his choice. He turned and walked toward the livery stable. He did not walk with the heavy, defeated step of a man going home to sleep. He walked with the quiet, deadly purpose of a man who has decided that if the law is crooked, he will break it. He entered the stable, the smell of hay and horses greeting him. He found Buster in his stall. The horse nickered softly. "Quiet now," Jesse whispered. He began to saddle the horse in the dark. He moved by touch, his hands sure and steady. He checked the cinch. He checked the stirrups. He went to the tack room and found a spare saddlebags. He filled them with what he could find. A bag of jerky, a canteen of water, a box of shells for his Winchester. He took a heavy woolen blanket and rolled it tight, tying it behind the saddle. He checked his Colt, 6 rounds. He checked the Winchester in the scabbard, fully loaded. He was crossing a line. He knew that. By morning, he would be a criminal. He would be hunted. He would lose his job, his reputation, and likely his life. But as he tightened the final strap, he thought of Evelyn's face through the bars. He thought of her wish for a gentler world. He could not give her a gentler world, but he could give her a chance. He led the horse to the back door of the livery, watching the storm build in the west. The wind was howling now, a deafening roar that would mask the sound of hoofbeats. "I am coming." "Evelyn," Jesse whispered into the darkness. He mounted up and rode into the teeth of the storm, leaving Jesse Cole, the honest ranch hand, behind. and becoming something else entirely. The storm did not arrive. It assaulted. It began as a bruised discoloration on the western horizon, a stain spreading across the hard, pale sky, before swelling into a wall of roiling earth that swallowed the sun. By mid-afternoon, Dry Creek had ceased to exist as a town of wood and stone and had become a ghost of itself, lost in a brown twilight. The wind screamed down the main street, carrying with it the red dust of the Badlands, grinding it against the clapboard siding until the buildings groaned in protest. Visibility dropped to the length of a horse's neck. The air turned thick and gritty, tasting of copper and ancient dirt. Men who had been loitering on the porch of the dusty spur retreated inside, jamming chairs against the doors to keep them from blowing open. The general store shuttered its windows. The world had shrunk to a blind, choking chaos. Jesse Cole moved through this brown purgatory like a shadow. He had tied a bandana over his nose and mouth, pulling his hat low until the brim touched his eyebrows. The wind lashed at him, driving sand into the weave of his coat and stinging the exposed skin around his eyes. He led Buster by the reins. The horse was nervous, dancing sideways as tumbleweeds shot past like frightened animals. Jesse kept a hand on the animal's neck, murmuring words that were snatched away by the gale before they could leave his lips. He reached the jailhouse. It was a dark, blocky shape in the swirling gloom. The lamp inside was a faint, sickly yellow square against the storm. Jesse tied Buster to the rail, wrapping the reins tight. He patted the saddlebags he had packed. Water, jerky, ammunition. It was a meager inheritance for a life on the run, but it was all he had. He pushed open the heavy oak door. The wind fought him for it, trying to rip it from his hinges, before he managed to slam it shut behind him. The sudden silence of the room was jarring, though the roar outside continued to vibrate through the floorboards. Marshal Tom Riker was sitting at his desk, his feet propped up, cleaning a rifle. He looked up as Jesse entered. His eyes narrowed against the smoke of the kerosene lamp. Hell of a night to be out. "Cole," Riker grunted. Jesse pulled down his bandana, shaking the dust from his coat. "I was checking on my horse at the livery," Jesse lied. "The roof is rattling something fierce. I thought I would check on yours while I was at it. Make sure the beasts are not spooked." Riker nodded, accepting the logic of a cowboy worrying about stock. "They are fine. I checked them an hour ago." Jesse walked over to the stove in the corner, warming his hands. He glanced toward the cell area. It was dark back there, but he could see the silhouette of Evelyn sitting on the bench, her head bowed. She had not moved since he left. "She has been quiet?" Jesse asked. "Quiet as the grave," Riker said. "She needs water." "Tom," Jesse said, "and a blanket. It is dropping to freezing out there, and that stone box is an ice house." Riker sighed. He put down the rag he was using to oil the rifle. "You are a persistent man." "Jesse, she is human," Jesse said. "Even if she is guilty, she does not need to freeze." Riker hesitated, then stood up. He grabbed a ring of keys from the hook on the wall. "Fine," the marshal said. "Grab the blanket from the spare cot. I will get the water." Jesse grabbed the rough wool blanket. His heart was hammering against his ribs, a frantic rhythm that seemed louder than the storm. He followed Riker back to the cells. Riker unlocked the heavy iron door to the cell block. Evelyn looked up. In the dim light, her face was a pale oval of misery. When she saw Jesse, her eyes widened slightly, a flicker of confusion and hope. "Mister, Cole brought you a blanket," Riker said, unlocking the cell door. Jesse stepped inside. He handed Evelyn the blanket. As her fingers brushed the wool, he leaned in close, his back to Riker. "I'm getting you out," he whispered. His voice was a thread of sound, meant only for her. Evelyn froze. She stared at him, her lips parting. She shook her head, a tiny, terrified movement. "Do not," she breathed. "There is no turning back," Jesse whispered, his eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that burned. "If you stay, Silas takes you. If you go, we run. Decide now." Evelyn looked at him. She looked at the open door. She thought of Silas Caro's hands on her arms, the smell of his cigar smoke, the promise of a life spent as a bird in a gilded cage. singing for her supper while her soul rotted. Then she looked at Jesse, a man who had nothing but a horse and a gun, offering to burn his life to the ground just to give her a chance at freedom. The choice was terrifying. It meant branding herself a criminal forever. It meant being hunted, but it was a choice made with her own voice. She nodded. Jesse turned back to Riker, who was standing in the doorway holding a tin cup of water. "Tom," Jesse said. "I'm sorry." Riker blinked. "For what?" "For this." Jesse lunged. He moved with the explosive speed of a man who has spent his life wrestling steers. He caught Riker by the shoulders, driving him backward into the empty cell across the hall. Riker shouted, dropping the water cup. It clattered loudly on the stone floor. He grappled with Jesse, his hands going for his gun, but Jesse was younger and desperate. Jesse slammed the marshal against the back wall of the cell, knocking the wind out of him. Before Riker could recover, Jesse stripped the gun from the marshal's holster and tossed it into the hallway. He shoved Riker down onto the cot and sprinted out of the cell, slamming the iron door shut. The lock clicked with a sound like a gunshot. Jesse stood panting in the corridor, the keys in his hand. Riker scrambled to the bars, his face red with fury and shock. "Cole, you are making a mistake. You are hanging yourself, boy." "I know," Jesse said. He looked at the older man with genuine regret. "I will leave the keys on the desk. Tom, someone will find you by morning. I truly am sorry." He turned to Evelyn. She was standing in her cell, her hands pressed to her mouth, trembling violently. "Come on," Jesse said. He unlocked her cuffs. The metal fell away, clattering to the floor. Evelyn rubbed her wrists, staring at him as if he were a stranger and a savior all at once. "We have to go," Jesse said. "Now." They ran through the office. Jesse grabbed Riker's rifle from the desk. He would need every weapon he could get, and blew out the lamp. They burst out into the storm. The wind hit them like a physical blow, nearly knocking Evelyn off her feet. The sand was flying horizontally, a scourging grit that flayed the skin. Jesse grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the hitching rail where Buster was tossing his head, wide-eyed with panic. Jesse mounted first, fighting the horse's fear. He reached down and hauled Evelyn up behind him. She wrapped her arms around his waist, burying her face in his coat to escape the stinging sand. "Hold on!" Jesse shouted over the roar. He spurred the horse. Buster leaped forward, eager to run, eager to be away from the howling buildings. They galloped down the invisible main street, past the saloon where the piano was silent, past the church with its dark steeple, and out into the open, unforgiving void of the prairie. The ride was a descent into hell. There was no road, only the instinct in Jesse's bones and the lay of the land he had ridden for years. The world had narrowed to the few feet in front of Buster's nose. The wind cut like knives, finding every gap in their clothing. Sand coated their eyelashes, crunched in their teeth, and scraped their skin raw. Evelyn clung to Jesse with a desperation that bordered on pain. She could feel the muscles of his back working as he fought to keep the horse steady. She could hear the animal's labored breathing, a harsh sawing sound against the wind. Her own heart was beating a frantic rhythm against Jesse's spine. They rode for what felt like hours, though it might have been only one. Time had no meaning in the storm. There was only the wind and the cold and the terrifying darkness. "We have to stop!" Jesse yelled back at her. "The horse cannot take much more of this." He turned Buster toward a ridge of jagged rocks that rose out of the gloom like the spine of a buried dragon. Tucked against the leeward side, half buried in a drift of old tumbleweeds and sand, was a structure. It was an abandoned line shack, a crooked little cabin built by some optimistic herder 20 years ago and left to rot. The roof was sagging, and the logs were bleached gray, but it was standing. Jesse dismounted and pulled Evelyn down. Her legs gave way when she hit the ground, numb from the cold and the riding. He caught her, holding her upright against the gale. "Inside," he ordered. He kicked the door open. It shrieked on rusted hinges. They stumbled into the black interior. Jesse dragged the door shut and threw the wooden bolt, instantly cutting the roar of the wind down to a dull, vibrating moan. The silence inside was heavy and sudden. It was pitch black. Jesse fumbled in his pockets for a match. He struck it on his boot heel. The flare of sulfur illuminated a small, squalid room. There was a stone fireplace, a broken table, and a single wooden bunk in the corner filled with dry straw. Jesse lit the stub of a candle he found on the table. "We stay here until the wind dies," he said. He moved efficiently, checking the chimney for blockages, then breaking up an old chair to build a small fire. Evelyn stood in the center of the room, shivering uncontrollably. She was covered in dust. Her black dress was gray with it. Her hair was a tangled mane of grit. She looked wild and broken. Jesse got the fire going. It was a pathetic, smoky thing, but it offered a flicker of warmth. He turned to Evelyn. "Come here," he said gently. "Get by the fire." She moved like a sleepwalker. She sat on the hearth, holding her hands out to the weak flames. Jesse went to the horse, which he had led into a small lean-to attached to the back of the shack, and returned with the saddle blankets and the canteen. "Drink," he said, handing her the tin. Evelyn took a sip. The water tasted of tin and dust, but it was the sweetest thing she had ever known. She looked up at Jesse. He was watching her, his face streaked with dirt, his eyes dark with worry. "You ruined your life," she whispered. Her voice was raspy. "You ruined your life for me." Jesse sat down beside her on the dirty floor. He took off his hat and ran a hand through his hair, shaking out the sand. "My life was not much to ruin," he said. "Just a bunk and a paycheck. It was honest. Evelyn said it was safe. Now you are an outlaw. Riker will come. Silas will come. Let them come," Jesse said. The temperature in the shack was dropping rapidly. The storm outside was sucking the heat right out of the walls. The single blanket from the jail and the saddle blanket were not enough. "We need to share the heat," Jesse said. "It is the only way we will not freeze." He led her to the bunk in the corner. The straw rustled as they sat down. He wrapped the blankets around both of them, pulling her back against his chest so that they were spooned together, wrapped in a cocoon of wool and body heat. They sat in the dark, the fire dying down to embers. The wind hissed through the cracks in the logs, bringing in tiny drifts of snow-like sand. Evelyn was shaking, her teeth chattering. Jesse wrapped his arms tighter around her, rubbing her arms to generate friction. "I am sorry," she said into the darkness. "I am so sorry." "Jesse, hush," he said, his mouth close to her ear. "Do not apologize. I have to," she insisted. "You do not know. You do not know what it is like, to be looked at and not seen, to be a thing. Silas. He looked at me like I was a prize heifer, and before him, the men in the saloons. They looked at me like a meal." She turned in his arms, shifting so she could look at his face in the dim red glow of the embers. "I wanted to be decent," she said, tears cutting tracks through the dust on her face. "I wanted to be someone who deserved a man like you, but I am just a fraud in a stolen dress." Jesse looked at her. He saw the shame that had been eaten at her for years. He saw the fear that she was unlovable. "You are not a fraud," Jesse said. His voice was rough with emotion. "You are the bravest woman I have ever known." He took a breath, the confession he had been holding back for years pressing against his teeth. "I have been afraid too. Evelyn, since Mary died, since I buried my boy, I have been walking around dead. I was afraid to feel anything. I thought if I let myself care about someone again, I would be betraying them. I thought my heart was buried in that frozen ground in Montana." He reached up and touched her cheek. His hand was calloused, rough as bark, but his touch was reverent. "But you," he whispered, "you woke me up. When I pulled you from that cliff, I felt the blood start moving in my veins again, and I hated you for it at first. I hated that you made me feel alive when I just wanted to be numb." Evelyn stared at him. The admission hung in the air, fragile and profound. "You are not numb now," she whispered. "No," Jesse said. "I am terrified, and I am angry, and I want you so much it hurts." The confession broke the dam. Evelyn let out a small, choked sound, half sob, half laugh. She reached out and gripped his coat, pulling him closer. "I do not want to be used." "Jesse," she said fiercely, "I want to be wanted. I want to be touched by someone who knows my name, who knows my sins and does not look away." "I am looking," Jesse said. "I see all of it. He leaned in. The kiss was not like the one through the bars. That had been a goodbye. This was a collision. It was slow and deep, tasting of the journey and the fear. His mouth was warm, demanding but giving. Evelyn melted against him. For the first time in her life, she was not calculating. She was not thinking about angles or escape routes. She was simply feeling. She felt the strength in his arms, the roughness of his unshaven jaw, the frantic beat of his heart against hers. The intensity of it was overwhelming. To be alive, here, in this storm, on the edge of the world, felt like a miracle. In the darkness of the shack, the barriers fell away. The heavy coat, the dusty dress, the layers of defense they had both built against a cruel world, it all slipped aside. There were no words left to say. There was only the sound of ragged breathing and the rustle of straw. There was the feeling of skin on skin, hot and electrifying against the chill of the room. It was a reclaiming. For Evelyn, it was a reclaiming of her body from the men who had rented it. For Jesse, it was a reclaiming of his heart from the grave. They moved together with a fierce tenderness, an urgent need to be as close as two people could possibly be, to defy the emptiness of the prairie outside with the fullness of their connection. It was an act of survival as much as passion. Later, much later, the wind began to die. The roaring silence outside was matched by the peace inside the shack. They lay tangled together under the scratchy blankets, limbs heavy with exhaustion. The fire was dead, but they were warm. Evelyn lay with her head on Jesse's chest, listening to the slow, steady thump of his heart. She was crying silently, the tears soaking into his shirt. "Why are you crying?" Jesse asked softly, his hand stroking her hair. "Because I am happy," she whispered. "And because I am afraid morning will come." "Morning will come," Jesse said, "but we will face it." He kissed the top of her head. "Whatever comes next, Evelyn, we do it together. No more running alone." She nodded against his chest, holding him tighter. Dawn broke not with sunlight, but with a cold, gray clarity. The storm had scoured the sky clean, leaving it a harsh, metallic blue. The landscape was transformed. Dunes of sand had shifted. Landmarks were buried, and the air was razor-sharp. Jesse was awake before the light. He dressed quietly, checking his weapons. He stepped outside the shack, scanning the horizon. The land was vast and empty, a sea of gullies, scrub brush, and jagged red rocks. But in the distance, perhaps 3 miles out, he saw movement, tiny dark specks against the pale earth. Riders. He watched them for a long moment. They were tracking. They were moving slowly, reading the ground where the wind hadn't scrubbed the hoofprints clean. Silas's men, and likely Riker. Driven by duty and humiliation, Jesse went back inside. Evelyn was sitting up in the bunk, wrapped in the blanket. She looked soft in the morning light, her hair loose around her shoulders, but her eyes were alert. "They are coming?" she asked. "Yes," Jesse said, 3 miles back. "They will be here within the hour." Evelyn stood up. She began to dress, her movements efficient. She did not panic. The woman who had trembled in the jail was gone. The survivor was back. But this time, she was not alone. "We cannot run forever," Evelyn said, buttoning her dress. "Not in this country. They have fresh horses and supplies. We have 1 horse and a canteen." Jesse nodded. He looked at the Winchester in his hand. "If we run, they will hunt us until we starve or they shoot us down." Jesse said, "There is no life for us on the run." "Evelyn, not a life worth living." "Then what do we do?" she asked. Jesse looked at her. He thought of the town. He thought of the silence of the good people who let evil men rule them because they were afraid. "We stop running," Jesse said. "We go back." "Back?" Evelyn stared at him. "To Dry Creek? That is suicide. Not if we bring the truth with us." Jesse said, "You said your husband kept records. You said he had a ledger of his scams." Evelyn nodded slowly. "He did. He kept it to ensure his partners did not cheat him. But I do not have it. It was in his saddlebags when he ran." Jesse shook his head. "No, not that ledger. I mean Silas Caro." Evelyn frowned. "What? Silas?" Jesse said. "He is a careful man, but he is arrogant. He's been stealing water rights for years. He's been bribing the judge. I've seen the way he does business. And I know people, railroad workers, former hands he cheated, who have stories to tell." "We gather proof?" Evelyn asked, skepticism in her voice. "Jesse, the town hates me. They will not listen. They will listen if we make them," Jesse said grimly. "We go to the camps. We find the men Silas destroyed. We build a case that even Riker cannot ignore. And then we'd ride back into Dry Creek and we'd drag Silas Caro's sins out into the light." He walked over to her and took her hands. "If we run, we are guilty. If we fight, we have a chance to be free. Really free." Evelyn looked at him. She saw the resolve in his face. It was a crazy plan. It was dangerous. It was likely to get them killed. But she thought of the way the town had looked at her. She thought of the shame she had carried. And she realized she was tired of hiding. She was tired of being the victim. She squeezed his hands. "Let's do it," she said. Jesse smiled. A grim, hard smile. "Get your boots on. Mrs. Hart, we have a lot of riding to do." They walked out of the shack together. The sun was cresting the horizon now, illuminating the riders in the distance. Jesse helped Evelyn onto Buster, then swung up behind her. He turned the horse not away from the pursuers, but sideways, cutting across the rough country toward the mining camps in the south. Survival was no longer enough. Now, they wanted justice. And they were going to take it from the cold, dead hands of the men who had tried to bury them. The weeks that followed were a blur of hard miles and cold ash. Jesse and Evelyn rode south first, dropping down into the dry riverbeds where the shanty camps of the railroad gangs clung to the earth like barnacles. They moved west to the mining claims that had busted a decade prior, where men with gray beards and broken backs still sifted through the tailings, looking for the dust of a dream. It was a brutal existence. The wind never seemed to stop, scouring their faces until their skin was as rough as parchment. They slept on the hard ground, wrapped in the same blankets, their bodies pressed together for warmth. There was little talk during the daylight hours. The land demanded their full attention. Every shift in the rock, every distant plume of dust, could be Riker or Silas's hired guns. But at night, by the flickering light of a fire built in a deep arroyo to hide the smoke, they spoke. They pieced together the fragments of a conspiracy that was larger than a single stolen ranch. They found a man named Tobias in a canvas tent near the salt flats. He was missing 3 fingers on his left hand and had a cough that sounded like rattling dry bones. He had been a foreman for the double bar before Silas fired him for asking questions about water diversion. Caro did not just steal the water. Tobias rasped, spitting into the fire. He poisoned the wells of the neighbors. I saw him order the carcasses of sick cattle dumped into the creeks upstream of the mesmerizing homesteads. He starved them out, then bought the land for pennies. They found a railroad clerk named Elias hiding in a drift shack, drinking away the memory of a ledger he had been forced to burn. He told them about the land grants, how Silas had paid judges to lose deeds, making legal owners into squatters overnight. And then, near the border of the territory, they found the piece of the puzzle that turned Evelyn's blood to ice. They met a one-eyed card dealer who had worked the circuit in Kansas during the years Evelyn and her husband were running their scams. He remembered Silas Caro. Caro was the backer. The dealer told them, eyeing the coin Jesse placed on the table. He put up the stake money for the big cons. That game where the man died? Caro was in town that week. He held the debt on your husband, Mrs. Hart, or Mrs. Cross, as you were then. He told your husband to provoke the mark. He wanted a chaotic end, so he could seize the mark's rail shares in the confusion. Your husband was just the hammer, and you were just the distraction. Evelyn sat in the silence of the camp, the truth settling on her like a heavy stone. She had not just been a victim of her husband's greed. She had been a pawn in Silas Caro's empire building since before she ever set foot in Dry Creek. Her crime was not fraud. Her crime was being the disposable element in a rich man's game. "We have enough," Jesse said, watching her face in the firelight. Evelyn looked at him. She was thinner now, her cheekbones sharp, her hands rough, but her eyes were clear. "We go back," she said, They turned north. Marshal Tom Riker caught them 3 days from Dry Creek. They were riding through a narrow slot canyon, the red walls rising 300 feet on either side, blotting out the sun. It was a natural ambush point, and Riker knew the terrain better than they did. He stepped out from behind a boulder, his Winchester leveled at Jesse's chest. 2 deputies appeared on the rim above, rifles trained. End of the line. "Cole!" Riker shouted, his voice echoing off the stone. "Step down from the horse. Keep your hands where I can see them." Jesse stopped Buster. He raised his hands slowly. Evelyn did the same, her heart hammering against Jesse's back. "Do not shoot, Tom!" Jesse called out. "We are coming in, but we are not coming in to hang. You are coming in to face the law," Riker said, walking closer, his finger tight on the trigger. "You assaulted an officer. You broke jail, and she is wanted for murder. She was framed." "Riker!" Jesse yelled. "By the same man who's buying your town out from under you." Riker stopped 10 paces away. He looked tired. The chase had worn him down. "2, I have heard stories. Cole, every outlaw has a story. We have witnesses." Evelyn spoke up. Her voice was steady, ringing clear in the canyon. "We have names. Tobias, Elias. We know about the poisoned wells. We know about the rail shares. Silas Caro arranged the game in Kansas. He owns you, Marshal, just like he tried to own me." Riker lowered the rifle an inch. He looked at Evelyn. He saw the dust in her hair, the exhaustion in her posture, and the fierce, unyielding light in her eyes. It was not the look of a guilty woman running from her sins. It was the look of a woman running toward a reckoning. "Silas has been pressuring the judge to sign the custody order in absentia," Riker admitted grudgingly. "He is eager to get his hands on you. Too eager for a man who just wants justice." "Give us a chance," Jesse said. "Bring us in. Let us speak in front of the town. If they still want to hang her after they hear the truth, I will tie the rope myself. But you owe the law more than just blind obedience to a rich man." Riker stared at them for a long minute. The wind moaned through the canyon. Finally, he lowered the rifle completely. "If you run again, I will shoot you in the back," Riker said. "We are done running," Jesse said. They rode into Dry Creek at high noon. The sun was a white blister in the sky, beating down on the dust-choked streets. The town was quiet, but as Riker led them down the main thoroughfare, people began to emerge from the shops and the saloon. Word spread instantly. They caught them, the cowboy and the widow. A crowd gathered in the street outside the saloon. It was a sea of grim faces, men who had lusted after Evelyn, women who had scorned her, and the shopkeepers who lived in fear of Silas Caro's debt collectors. Riker stopped his horse in the center of the street. He gestured for Jesse and Evelyn to dismount. They stood in the dust, shoulder to shoulder. Jesse's hand brushed hers, a silent promise. "Get Silas Caro," Riker ordered a deputy. Silas did not need to be fetched. He was already standing on the porch of the bank, watching the scene with a thin, confident smile. He walked down the steps, adjusting his silk tie, moving with the arrogance of a king greeting his subjects. "Well done. Marshal," Silas called out. "I see you finally ran the rats to ground. This is not a sentencing." "Silas," Riker said, his voice hard. "This is a hearing." "A hearing?" Silas laughed. "The woman is a fugitive. The man is a jailbreaker. The hearing is over. Put them in irons." "Not yet," Jesse said. He stepped forward, his voice projecting to the back of the crowd. "We have some things to say first, and we have some people you might remember." From the back of the crowd, the witnesses Jesse and Evelyn had gathered, brave souls who had ridden back with the marshal's party, stepped forward. Tobias held up his maimed hand. Elias the clerk stood with a ledger he had rewritten from memory. And then, Riker reached into the saloon and dragged out Rafe Nolan. The gambler looked pale. He tried to pull away, but Riker's grip was iron. "Tell them." "Rafe," Riker growled. "Tell them who paid you to spread the stories about Lena Cross." Rafe looked at Silas. Silas's eyes were narrow slits of fury. I do not know what you mean," Rafe stammered. "Tell them." Riker shouted, shaking him. "Caro paid me," Rafe squealed. "He paid me $50 to come here. He told me to make sure everyone knew she was a harlot. He said if I ruined her name, she would have nowhere to turn but to him." The crowd murmured. The women on the boardwalk exchanged uneasy glances. The narrative was cracking. Jesse looked at the townspeople. "He poisoned your wells," Jesse said, pointing at Silas. "He stole your deeds, and he used this woman's life as a bargaining chip in a game none of you knew was being played." Then Evelyn stepped forward. She stood alone in the center of the circle. She wore her dusty black dress, her hair wind-blown, her face stripped of all paint and artifice. She looked at the men who had jeered at her. She looked at Mrs. Gable and Mrs. Avery. "I am not a saint," Evelyn said. Her voice shook, then steadied. "I have done things to survive that would make you turn your heads in shame. I was 16 when I was married to a man who taught me that my only value was in my face and my body." She took a breath, forcing herself to speak the ugly truth. "I learned to smile when I wanted to scream. I learned to let men touch me so my husband could rob them. I was the bait in the trap. I carry that sin. I carry the memory of the man who died in Kansas, a man my husband cheated on Mr. Caro's orders." She looked directly at Silas. "But I am not a murderer, and I am not a whore by choice. I was a girl who was beaten until she broke, and I am done breaking. You can hang me if the law demands it, but do not hang me for his crimes." Silence stretched over the street. It was heavy and thick. The wind rustled the dry grass. Mrs. Avery, the stern shopkeeper, stepped off the boardwalk. She looked at Evelyn, really looked at her, and saw not a temptress, but a survivor of a brutal world. "She has the right to speak." "Mrs." Avery said quietly. Silas's face turned a mottled purple. He saw the shift in the crowd. He saw the way the men were looking at him with suspicion instead of fear. He saw his empire crumbling because of a cowboy and a woman he had meant to discard. "Lies!" Silas shouted. He stepped off the porch, his hand going to his hip. "She is a witch. She has bewitched this fool Cole, and now she is trying to poison you all against your benefactor." "The law will decide," Riker said, stepping between Silas and the prisoners. "I am the law in this valley," Silas roared. He drew his gun. It happened in a blur of motion and noise. The crowd screamed and scattered. Silas fired wild, his bullet taking a chunk out of the dirt near Evelyn's feet. Jesse shoved Evelyn to the ground, drawing his own Colt. Silas fired again. The bullet caught Jesse in the side, spinning him around. He grunted, falling to one knee, his gun clattering from his hand and sliding away in the dust. Riker drew his weapon, but Silas was faster. Turning the gun on the marshal, he fired, grazing Riker's shoulder, sending the lawman stumbling back against a hitching post. Silas stood over them, his chest heaving, his eyes wild with the madness of a man losing everything. He aimed his gun at Jesse's head. "I told you I would bury you, boy!" Silas hissed. Evelyn was on the ground. Her heart was pounding so hard she thought it would burst. She saw Jesse bleeding in the dirt. She saw the gun in Silas's hand, and she saw Jesse's fallen revolver lying 3 feet away. For a lifetime, she had been told she was the problem. She had been told she was weak. She had been told her hands were made for pouring drinks and soothing men's tempers. She scrambled forward. Her hand closed around the cold steel of the Colt. It was heavy, heavier than she expected. Silas heard the movement. He began to turn toward her, a sneer forming on his lips. Evelyn did not hesitate. She did not think. She raised the gun with both hands, shaking violently, and pulled the trigger. The boom was deafening. The kick of the weapon jarred her shoulders. Silas Caro jerked backward as if he had been kicked by a mule. A red flower bloomed on his chest. He looked down at it, an expression of utter confusion on his face. Before his knees buckled, he fell face first into the dust he had claimed to own. The silence that followed was absolute. Smoke drifted in the hot air. Evelyn sat in the dirt, the smoking gun still clutched in her hands. She was gasping for air, staring at the body. She had killed a man. She had done the one thing she swore she would never do. But as she looked at Jesse, who was clutching his side and looking at her with fierce, painful gratitude. She felt no regret, only a terrible, resounding finality. Jesse crawled over to her. He ignored the blood soaking his shirt. He took the gun from her hands gently and pulled her into his arms. "It is over," he rasped. "It is over." The territorial judge arrived 4 days later, riding in a black carriage flanked by 2 federal marshals. He was a stern man, but he was not Silas's cousin, and he was not on anyone's payroll. The hearings were long, Riker testified. His arm in a sling. The witnesses from the camps testified. Evelyn testified again. Her voice stronger this time. The evidence against Silas Caro was overwhelming. The ledgers, the testimony of the card dealer, the pattern of land theft. It painted a picture of a criminal enterprise that wrought the territory from the inside out. The judge ruled that the shooting of Silas Caro was a justifiable act of defense of a third party. The charges against Helena Crow, Evelyn, were reduced to fraud. And considering the coercion and the time served in the jail of public opinion, the judge suspended the sentence. Justice, slow and imperfect, had finally leaned toward fairness, but Dry Creek was not a place of easy forgiveness. Though the legal chains were broken, the social ones remained. When Evelyn walked down the street, people no longer shouted, but they whispered. They nodded respectfully, but they did not invite her to tea. She was a woman who had killed a powerful man. She was dangerous. 2 weeks after the shooting, Evelyn packed her trunk in the boarding house. She put on her black dress, though she left the veil behind. She walked downstairs. Mrs. Gable was there, along with a few of the other boarders. "I am leaving," Evelyn said quietly. "Thank you for the room, Mrs." Gable nodded, her face unreadable. "Good luck to you, Mrs. Hart." Evelyn walked out onto the porch. A stagecoach was waiting to take her to the railhead. She believed it was the only way. Jesse belonged here. He was a cowboy, a man of the land. She was a stain on his reputation. If she left, maybe the town would forgive him. She walked toward the coach, her head down. "Evelyn!" The shout rang out from the end of the street. Jesse was walking toward her. He was moving stiffly, favoring his injured side, but his stride was determined. He was not wearing his work clothes. He was wearing a clean shirt and his best vest. He stopped in the middle of the street, between her and the stagecoach. A crowd began to watch, sensing a final act to the drama. "Where are you going?" Jesse asked. "I am leaving." "Jesse," Evelyn said, "it is better this way. You have your life here. I will only drag you down." Jesse looked around. He looked at the faces of the townspeople watching them. He saw the judgment, the curiosity, the lingering prejudice. He took a deep breath. "I do not want a life here without you," he said loud enough for everyone to hear. He stepped closer and took her hand. He held it up, displaying their interlaced fingers to the town. "This woman," Jesse announced, his voice ringing off the storefronts. "You call her a temptress. You call her a widow. You call her a liar. But I call her the bravest soul I have ever met." He looked at Evelyn, his eyes shining. "She is a survivor. She walked through hell and came out the other side with her heart still beating. She saved my life on the cliff, and she saved it again in the dust. I love her. I love the temptress, and the widow, and the girl who was scared. I love all of her." He turned his gaze to the town, his expression defiant. "And the worst sin I ever committed was thinking I had the right to judge her. We are all just trying to survive out here. If you cannot see her worth, then you can turn your faces away, because I am not letting her go." Evelyn's eyes filled with tears. The raw vulnerability of his choice to claim her, publicly, with all her scars and baggage, broke through the last of her defenses. She squeezed his hand. "I felt dead," she whispered to him, ignoring the crowd. "Every time a man touched me, I felt dead, but with you, I feel terrifyingly, beautifully alive." Jesse smiled. "Then let's go live." They did not take the stagecoach. They retrieved Buster and a second horse Jesse had bought. They rode out of Dry Creek together, leaving the whispers and the dust behind them. They did not go far. They found a patch of land near the cliffs where they had first met. A high, lonely place, where the wind sang through the canyons and the sky stretched on forever. The land was stubborn, the soil was rocky, and the winters were brutal. They built a cabin with their own hands, felling the timber and dragging the stones. It was a rough, crooked little house, but it was strong. They learned to live without masks. There were hard days. There were days when the cattle broke the fence or the well ran dry. There were nights when Evelyn woke screaming, dreaming of the gun going off in her hand. But there were other moments. There was the morning Jesse found Evelyn trying to chop wood, swearing like a sailor when the axe stuck. He laughed until his side hurt, and she threw a handful of wood chips at him before kissing the laughter right out of his mouth. There was the evening Evelyn wore the red dress, not for a mark, but for him, and they danced in the tiny kitchen to no music but the wind, reclaiming the color from her past. There was the night Jesse woke from a nightmare of the freezing cold in Montana, shaking and sweating, only to find Evelyn already holding him, her warm body a solid anchor in the dark. Their desire remained intense, a fire that never really went out, but it was no longer a desperate, consuming thing. It was a shared warmth, a steady hearth that kept the cold at bay. One evening, a year later, they stood at the edge of the cliff. The sun was setting, painting the canyon walls in shades of violent orange and deep purple. The wind whipped Evelyn's hair and tugged at Jesse's coat. They held hands, looking down into the abyss where she had once nearly fallen. "It is a long way down," Evelyn said softly. "It is," Jesse agreed. He squeezed her hand, his thumb rubbing over the knuckles that were now calloused and strong. "But I have got you." "I know," she said, "and I have got you." They stood on the edge of the wilderness, two scarred people in a harsh land. They had walked through tragedy, prejudice, and violence. They had seen the worst of the world and the worst of themselves. But as the sun dipped below the horizon and the first stars appeared, sharp as needles in the darkening sky, they turned back toward the cabin where a light was burning in the window. They chose to stay, on the land, with each other, and in a love that had refused to die. Thank you all for listening to this story of the American West. It has been a pleasure to ride the trail with Jesse and Evelyn alongside you. I would love to hear where you are listening from. Please leave a comment below and share your location. If you enjoyed this tale of love and survival, please subscribe to From Wild West for more stories from the frontier. I look forward to reading your thoughts and comments in English. Safe travels, partners.